Welcome to our fall film series. This is the second feature presentation in the series. The first was India's Daughter by Leslie Udwin, a controversial film made about India. I believe it's now up for an Oscar. Leslie was here, gave a riveting sort of introduction and Q&A, long Q&A afterwards to a packed house. So we're very excited about that. The fall film series is entitled Forms of Realism, so it deals with films that what do we call them? Non-fiction films. Forms of Realism, as you can imagine, makes scholars intellectually giddy whenever you hear the word forms and realism. There's so much to talk about. So this is a loose collection of films, but all of them very interesting in their own right. I hope that shortly you'll come to visit the next feature presentation in the series. It's two films. One is a new documentary about Eugenia Ginsburg, who is probably the most famous female survivor of one of Stalin's gulags. The filmmaker is a professor at the University of Heidelberg. He will be here presenting that film with Eugenia Ginsburg's daughter, Antonina Aksonova. And so that is a very special presentation. I believe it's the first screening in the United States. They will be here for a week exploring her mother's archives, which the University of Notre Dame has just acquired. So this is a very great chance, I think, to interact with some films, non-fictional films that are being made about important subjects right now. And then later in December, early in December, before all of you students leave, we're going to also have a very special event. There is a documentary made about Soviet ice hockey players called Red Army by a fellow named Gabe Polsky. Gabe will be here to introduce that film. It is a real crowd pleaser. It focuses on the Soviet players who defected from the Soviet Union to play in the NHL. Some of those defectors will be here at Notre Dame with Gabe, and the Institute, the Nanovic Institute, will be convening a panel discussion among them about their experience called Elite Athletes in the Cold War. So the screening of that film, also dealing with non-fictional events, but also in a very interesting way with the principles involved. So I hope that you can all be here for that. That will be on December the 10th. But tonight we have a real classic of the genre, if that's the right word, The Battle of Algiers by Gilles Pontecorvo. There are many people to thank for tonight's, but let me just single out Anne Leone from Italian Studies, and Ted Barron, of course, and Kevin here at the DeBartolo Performing Arts Center, and John Welly, and of course tonight's guest, Professor Alan OLeary, who is an associate professor of Italian at the University of Leeds. He's also the director of research at that University School of Languages, Cultures, and Societies. His own research really focuses tightly on Italian film and history, particularly films that were considered, quote, less exportable, right? And he is the author of an entire book-length treatment of tonight's film. So you are in a chair that will enable you to learn a great deal about this film. And I'm sure it's not realistic to expect that we'll hear all of Alan's insights tonight, but certainly some of them. And so without further ado, Professor Alan OLeary.
Thank you very much for that welcome, and thank you indeed for agreeing to show the Battle of Algiers this evening, because I'm aware that it's a film that's probably very familiar to some of you, may indeed be over familiar. I know it's been shown at the Nanovic quite recently. I'm working on the film, as Anthony just mentioned, as part of a project on Italian cinema and history, which I'll be discussing here at, sorry, I need to pronounce this correctly, Notre Dame. We would say Notre Dame, of course, on Thursday, but I want to begin by talking here not about Italian cinema, but of how the Battle of Algiers is a remarkable example of what we might call transnational filmmaking. And by this I mean that it was actually commissioned by the Algerians themselves in the immediate, in the era after they had achieved independence from the French. But it was made by Italians, and with dialogue, as you will see, in both Arabic and French. but it has an address. In other words, it's oriented towards, in terms of how it establishes a mode to speak to its audiences. It has this address that hopes to speak for the Italian nation, the new Italian nation, to the wider world. This is what I would say. And it does this in a film language that can speak to old Europe and, let's call it, the North, as well as addressing this constituency of, let's say, anti-colonial sentiment internationally. It does this through what I want to call a rhetoric of realism. So this series here, of course, is about realism. This is about a rhetoric of realism. Now, as you're well aware, I'm sure, the film deals with the independence struggle of the Algerians against the French. But it's useful to know that the historical Battle of Algiers itself was actually a relatively minor series of events in the overall achievement of Algerian self-determination. In the film, what this focus on this relatively minor series of events, the so-called Battle of Algiers, allows is a symbolic use of location. And that's what you get in the movie. So you get this kind of spatial dichotomy, as you can see here, between the so-called European city and the Maghrebi Kasbah, so the Western African Kasbah. In employing this opposition, the film is critiquing, but also, it has to be said, continuing an Orientalist, so an exoticizing tradition in colonial period French filmmaking. And here you can see the poster, and I'll show you an extract from an early sequence from the 1937 Pépé le Moko. This is a classic French movie starring Jean Gabin. And what you see here in this introductory sequence in the film is the Kasbah as a place of sexual adventurism, of criminality and of dirt.
Entre ces marches, des ruelles tortueuses et sombres, des ruelles en forme de guet-apens, des ruelles qui se croisent, se chevauchent, s'enlacent, se désenlacent dans un fouillis de labyrinthes. Les unes étroites comme des couloirs, les autres voûtées comme des caves. De tous côtés, dans tous les sens, des escaliers, des montées abruptes comme des échelles, des descentes vers des gouffres sombres et coulants. Des porches suintants, envahis de vermine et d'humidité. Des cafés obscurs, montés à toute heure.
So as we watch the film this evening, see if you can notice aspects of the representation that seem to recur to what we've just watched there. The film, The Battle of Algiers, is both deploying and, as I say, correcting this vision of the Kasbah as the place of otherness and threat, a place that must be tamed. Let me just get the next slide up. Yeah. Tamed by a kind of instrumentalized French rationality, which is represented in the Battle of Algiers by the figure of Colonel Mathieu, who is the very essence of the rational in the movie. And notice as well how the use of this male voiceover that we just noticed in Pépé le Moko is reprised in the Battle of Algiers, associated in the later film with the voice of French journalists. Now, this voiceover is to be contrasted to the powerful ululation sounds. I'm not sure how better to describe them, but a strange sort of vocalizing that's made by the local women in the film, The Battle of Algiers, during the Algerian protests. So the opposition of like the masculine voiceover versus the feminine Algerian strange ululation noises. And this is part, though, of what is a remarkably complex soundtrack in the film, which sometimes, for example, uses, or rather replaces, voice with music, as in the torture scenes for which the film is famous or notorious, or in the scenes of grieving after bombings that you will see. So the film shows these terrorist bombings, and we see grieving figures, but who are silenced, as it were, or their voices are replaced by music instead. So you see music there that seems to recall Bach's St. Matthew Passion, and it's used at several points during the film. Now, I know this film is being shown as part of a series, as Anthony was just explaining, devoted to realism, and forgive me if I say that The realism in the Battle of Algiers, which is very real, if I can overuse the word, has been exaggerated, however, or at least overemphasized to the detriment of other aspects. As I say, I think it's best to treat this film's realism in terms of its rhetoric, in other words, its mode of address. And now, by rhetoric, I mean the film's employment of certain conventions as the means by which it makes its historical argument about the rightness of anti-colonial struggle. Among other things, in the film, this realism takes the form of the use of a telephoto lens, which tends to flatten space, mobile camera, and a sort of distressed film stock, all of which recall newsreel footage. And remember, by the way, that this is a film made in 1966, so the idea to make it in black and white is a choice. And again, it's part of the recall of newsreel footage. Now, we've got used to techniques like this, or to understanding such techniques as part of a repertoire used to achieve a kind of visceral effect in cinema. So I'm going to give an example here from Paul Greengrass's Bourne film. So this is from the Bourne Ultimatum. These are action films that are in a direct line of inheritance, I would say, from the Battle of Algiers. And we finish with Matt Damon's face. Now, the editing is at a much faster pace in this particular film than we will find in the Battle of Algiers. However, what you do have is a hypermobile camera. You've got crash zoom, so when the camera zooms in very fast, and so on. These are techniques that you will find in the Battle of Algiers also. Now, as sophisticated viewers, as we are 21st century viewers, we know how the effect of realism in a movie like The Bourne Ultimatum is now it's a matter of tight choreography. It's a matter of virtuoso editing rather than some sort of humble witness before the real. And as I say, the Battle of Algiers anticipates this. I've said that the film employs an opposition between the European boulevards and the labyrinthine Casbah, which it does. But in the film's euphoric coda, this kind of amazing 6 minutes that closes the film, excuse me if that's a spoiler, I don't think it's too bad a one, but choral protests break out across the city. What we find there is this third space that eludes this opposition between the European city and the Casbah. These scenes, which draw on contemporary news photographs, so this is on the bottom there is a contemporary news photo from 1960, take place in residential areas and housing projects that are outside the city, the centre of the city or the Casbah. And indeed, this building here on the bottom right was in construction during the period of the Battle of Algiers itself, so in the mid to late 50s. Now, instead of realism then, where you get these choral sequences of riots that restage riots that happened in 1960, instead of realism, I think it's more appropriate to discuss scenes like this in terms of reenactment. In terms of a kind of ritualistic, communal, and indeed carnivalesque restaging of the scene of liberation. And this, to me at least, points to the not strictly historical character of the film's mode. Rather, for all the tragedy, the very real tragedy and the very real feeling, violence that it shows, the film is a kind of celebration. It's a celebratory film. And of course it would be. It's a birth of a nation film. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.